So let's just kind of start, I guess, with the title of this video. Although I'm referring to myself as a Russian, I'm not strictly a Russian, I guess, in the technical sense of where I was born, because I was born in Belarus. And yet, I've never actually considered myself Belarusian. I have maybe some of the scars, as it were, of what it means to be Belarusian, right? I was born not very far from the Ukrainian city Pripyat, right, which is where the Chernobyl disaster occurred, and all that radiation just kind of went north and some other directions too, but a lot of it ended up in Belarus, right? So I was born with various health problems due to this event, and yet I've never really had the opportunity to truly feel Belarusian, right? And there's a few reasons for this. I mean, first of all, I don't speak Belarusian, right? It's a completely different language from Russian. My family, of course, ethnically, I mentioned this in an earlier video, during World War II, they were all sort of like getting born and spending time in Vladivostok, and that's specifically because during the war, it was a lot easier to survive in the Far East, right? Because obviously the war with Germany wasn't in the East, right? You could at the very least like do some fishing, that kind of thing. But originally, my family was from around the Moscow region, right? It's called the Moscow Oblast. So I never really had the opportunity to feel Belarusian. And I think that probably goes for a lot of other people, right, in some of these republics, especially during the time of the USSR, right, which is like the other part of it, right? The other kind of difficult dynamic is, you know, are you actually Russian if you're just straight up from the USSR, right? It's a completely different situation, right? It's a completely different set of contexts. And since that's the case, I mean, just like think about it, right? It's a different flag, a different anthem. Of course, Russia recycled at least the tune of the USSR anthem, but it is very much a different context. And what we're noticing now is there's a growing generational divide between those that were born in the USSR, or even grew up in the USSR, versus a new generation of people, right? People that are no longer, they're no longer those that have some kind of affection for the core republic, right? Russia was the core republic of the USSR. And they don't even necessarily grow up with the Russian language. I've also mentioned this fact how, like when I was a teenager, and I would go into some of the, I call them Russian stores, right? But they weren't Russian stores in New York City. They were stores of various ethnic origins. It could be Georgian food, right? It could be restaurants specializing in Uzbekistani food, right? I've been a couple times to this one spot in Brighton Beach that is essentially like it's Korean women, right? They are the ones making this food, and yet they don't speak Korean, right? They only speak Russian. You can clearly tell they're ethnically Korean, but they don't speak Korean. They use flavors that are pretty unconventional. Like there's a lot of Asiatic influence. There's tons of noodles, but they might suddenly like throw in some dill, right? And that's not something you'd expect in Asian cooking. And I would go into some of these restaurants, some of these stores, and I would talk to the people working there, and they would answer me in Russian. I would talk to them in Russian, because that's kind of like, what was expected. It would be a little strange not to do that. In some spots, like they don't even speak English at all. Now, about 20 years later, you go into some of these places, and they don't speak Russian anymore, right? A lot of them just speak their own native tongues. So there's now this divide that's sort of grown, right? Ukrainians don't feel like they're part of anything larger, right? They just have this sort of nationalistic, thing going on. especially since now it's kind of like out of the bag, right? It was suppressed when the USSR was around. But Ukrainians now, they have the nationalism, right? Which is new, right? There's now an outlet for it. There's now also the West willing to help you in these feelings, right? And these like plans that you have for this nation state. And that's kind of important to remember, right? So they don't have, and also obviously there's going to be a ton of resentments going back a long time, to the extent that there are arguments that the famines that occurred in Ukraine during the more kind of generic USSR famines, some people claim it's outright genocide. Others say, you know, technically you can't make that argument. But whatever the case, it's not really going to matter to you, will it? You will be upset, right? Like, it doesn't matter why you died, right? Or why your family died. You're going to be upset no matter what in that situation. So don't even have to get on all these technical hang-ups in terms of like what's going on, what's happening. You could just, you know, you could just say the resentments were there from the very beginning. So all those affections, right? All that stuff is now done. I remember speaking to people that I knew, right? They're now much older, that were living in the USSR, like spend most of their lives there. You know, they would say, like, you know, during the time of the collapse, suddenly on those borders, if you go to some of the neighboring countries, there suddenly was a lot of discrimination against Russians, right? Which is, again, like, you know, I'm not here to like point fingers at anybody. It's just, I always want to think of this in a structural way, right? It's sort of predictable and understandable that regular people, right? They might be uneducated, they might be poor, they might be having all kinds of problems. They're going to start allowing all this hatred to come out because, you know, like you would look like the source of these problems, right? So speaking Russian in some places was difficult. Getting jobs in some of these places was difficult because it used to be that essentially, you know, one passport for everywhere, right? Going to a different republic was more or less kind of like going to a different, you know, different state, like in America, right? You could just sort of move republics. You could be like, oh yeah, I got a job in Kyiv, right? So we're going to go from Moscow to Kyiv, right? And it just sort of happened. Or I'm going to take a vacation somewhere in the south, or I'm going to go hiking in the north, and you just sort of did that, right? The mobility now is a lot less, right? Even with like some of these trade deals or whatever, right? There's a lot less mobility. There's a lot less fluidity in these borders. And that's kind of, you know, what you should come to expect, right? When you have obviously a collapse of an empire. So these fractures have emerged, right? There's a significant generational divide. At the same time, there's still a kind of weirdly enduring multiculturalism in Russia, right? You have foods and languages and ethnicities, you know, kind of like from all over the place. And I mean, you see some of the, like you see some of the Western propaganda, right? And you see some of the Russian propaganda on Twitter. And specifically the Russian propaganda, they do really like to overplay this notion of multiculturalism in Russia. You sort of have to, right? Because if you're on Twitter and you're writing in English and you're trying to capture, right? One Kremlin tactic is to capture as much of an audience as you can, right? You notice there's this odd sort of mix of sort of like pro-Putin types, kind of like almost from the very beginning. You know, some of them are hardcore, you know, like right-wing reactionaries. Other times you have like total, you know, like tanky type communists. All right, it's a very interesting coalition of people, wide variety of ideological stripes, and they sort of play to every possible ideological stripe. In fact, after the collapse of the USSR, you had something called the National Bolshevik Party that emerged. And the National Bolsheviks emerged specifically to address, like, you know, we have like a wide umbrella of ideologies, beliefs. So we want to capture as many as possible. So it would be like, you know, it would be like a straight up Nazi aesthetic, and yet you would use a hammer and sickle. Right? You'd have some of those Nazi colors. And it would be, you know, it would be communist. It would be, it's harder to say that, you know, in Russia that you ever really had like a typical, like truly Nazi contingent, simply because, you know, Nazism in Russia has a very different feel than even like Nazism in America, obviously, because in Russia, you know, 1/6 of the population died during World War II, Belarus a quarter. So these things were going on, so it's much harder to say that. I'm going to walk in a different direction. There's actually a, you're just like walking through tons of traffic. It's like there's like nice case studies of, if you look at people, for example, like jogging through places with tons of traffic, even if you're healthy, right, you want to jog, you want to do this, you want to do that, simply by breathing in the exhaust fumes, you might have, for instance, like a high blood pressure, right, simply because you're taking in mercury, right, you're taking other heavy metals that have that effect. Anyway, so we're going to walk in a little more quiet spot here. Yeah, so this, you know, National Bolshevik Party, right, it's trying to capture as many ideologies as possible. And this is not simply because the Russian Federation is not some kind of like, you know, hokey American-style liberal organization that is there for the sake of multiculturalism in the way that we understand it. Their multiculturalism, and to an extent, I mean, you could sort of say this about America as well, their style of multiculturalism is one of necessity, right? The Russian Empire from the beginning, right, it always sort of treated the acquisition of land preferentially. Since that's the case, right, if you're acquiring land and you're acquiring peoples very quickly, you're not going to be able to easily put down rebellions, you know, 1,000 miles to the east. You're not going to easily have your thumb on everything that's happening. You're going to need at least a little bit, right? Not that they even necessarily did this very well, but you're going to need at least a little bit of this sort of I'm trying to like think and walk in traffic without getting hit. So, you know, if you can't easily control everything that's going on within your borders because they're so large, you're going to need to offer some level of autonomy to these groups, right? Like, think of everything geopolitically, right? Think of it structurally. Think of it as something that's going on of like a material necessity, right? You're going to, in a place like America, right, if you have to only worry about, you know, you have an ocean to the west, you have an ocean to the east, you have friendly countries to the north and the south, and you have a country that's fairly large, but it's a lot smaller than Russia, for instance, right? You're going to be able to deal what's going on internally a lot better. In Russia, you're going to need, you know, more autonomy, right? Our states, it's not that they have no autonomy whatsoever, but a lot of times it's just kind of a joke, right? You go from state to state, you could have like wildly different laws. A lot of times it doesn't make too much sense, but you need some level of autonomy, right? There is differences, right? And even like in the future, I could sort of imagine in the next few decades, I can imagine Texas kind of like really rapidly industrializing over the, that like Texas, I forget the technical name, like Texas Triangle or something. It's like San Antonio, Dallas, Austin, Houston, right? They all form this like triangle that it's rapidly industrializing. We're getting tons of renewables, right? Like one of those cities, probably like Dallas or like something, is probably going to be the first city that is primarily, if not exclusively, running on renewables. And I can imagine in the future, with enough power and enough like cultural differences from, let's say, you know, like New York or whatever, you could imagine like breakaway states occurring, right? You could imagine a secessionist movement. I wouldn't be surprised if at the very least we start hearing rumors, right, and hints of this occurring, right, a few decades from now, at the latest probably. But again, like Russia always had to negotiate that in a different way, right? Russia had to give some level of autonomy, even during the USSR, right? There were a lot of promises made to the individual republics, right? Obviously, once the USSR became more powerful, a lot of these promises just totally fell away. Like, it was just sort of like irrelevant at that point. But as it's the same thing with Putin, right? I mean, like, Russia has 24 republics in its federation, but even those, over time, have been reduced in their autonomy simply because as Putin, became more powerful, as the state became more stable, right? As people became a bit more wealthy compared to like the natives of the 90s. These promises of autonomy, it's like, why would they take that deal anymore? Like, why would they negotiate away? Why would the state negotiate away its own power, right? If it could finally now sort of like stamp out any possibility of differences. But still, again, there's this veneer of multiculturalism, right? And it's still somewhat a multiculturalism of necessity, right? And it's important to view it that way, just geopolitically, materially, right? Always, like, even if you're not a Marxist, you have to use, historical materialism to inform what you think, right? Even if you don't agree with some of those Marxist predictions, or you don't believe that a society could be organized in such a way, you're going to have to use historical analysis, right? Historical materialism. You're going to have to look at the facts of the matter, right? Baseline, like what kinds of things are possible, how power negotiates, right? All of that, it should be part of your analysis. So that's the first part, right? And when you look at some of the conversations, right, among like the pro-Russia, like when I say pro-Russia, I mean specifically like referring to the kinds of things that have, broken along the lines of, during the Russia-Ukraine war, right? We have like tons of, pro-Russia types that are really playing up this like concept of like Russian multiculturalism, because they're, they know that if they're writing in English and they're trying to get people on their side, and that's the thing, like they could be totally genuine about this, but like it is interesting how things do tend to fall into whatever the grooves that are already pre-established for you, right? Like Russia has created for you these grooves of how to understand the world, how to sort of like get people on your side. And one of them is, we know that in the West, right, whether or not the West is genuine about it, like multiculturalism is like a thing, right? They push it, they talk about it. It could be, very superficially, but it happens. And, Russians understand this, right? So they're going to say, we are truly, a multicultural center. We are offering ourselves as an alternative to the West. It's a different way of doing things, right? We don't have to have the same systems. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of the West. At the same time, as that's happening, there's another interesting dynamic that emerges, which is, let me just cross this without dying. And this dynamic kind of became a lot clearer to me when I read Aleksandr Dugin's The Fourth Political Theory. And it's a book that basically, so Aleksandr Dugin is this philosopher in Russia, and he was well known for, I can't, I'm not going to say that he like constructed Russian foreign policy. That would be very silly. But some of the observations that he made in terms of like, how can Russia behave in a way that's kind of like, at least from his perspective, effective for Russian national self-interest in the 90s and beyond. And, like he just kind of, I guess, observed historically what was going on and just kind of wrote down the observations, right? It doesn't have to be more complicated than that, right? And in Fourth Political Theory, which is a book from I think it's like 2009 or something when it was published, he's basically describing that dynamic of multiculturalism, right? Like it's racist, right? He says that it's racist, and it's very insensitive to demand that all nation states do the same thing, behave the same way, believe everything that you'd believe, right? Obviously, like, the West would prefer if Putin's regime wasn't discriminatory towards homosexuals, right? They would prefer that you be able to protest in Russia without getting beat up, tortured, like whatever might happen. And what struck me immediately, though, is that this is what Nietzsche would deem slave morality, right? Aleksandr Dugin is engaging in slave morality. These arguments are arguments from weakness and insecurity, right? It's, you cannot do what you actually want to do, which is like, all nation states, if they could sort of throw their weight around, not have states, not have federations, but just do what they want, right? Most states would say, yeah, I'll do that, right? If you have the power to do so, if you have enough legitimacy in your rulers, right? If you have enough love and stability, right? Meaning love for you as a ruler and stability in the nation state, right? There's no reason why a nation state wouldn't attempt something like that, right? All power, wants to multiply, right? That's just how it is. But I get the feeling that Nietzsche would say this is an example of slave morality on the part of Dugin, because Russia wants to throw its weight around and it can't. And because it's making this argument from necessity, it is now saying, right, it's trying to turn back on the West, right, its own kind of claims about plurality and multiculturalism and tolerance. Why can't you be tolerant of us? If we don't want homosexuality in our borders, if we don't want trans people, we don't want this, we don't want that, why are you forcing it on us, right? And, if you're not from the West, this argument would make a lot of sense to you, because if you're not from the West for the most part, like even if you look at the way that the world is sort of like perceiving the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there's a ton of I can't say, like, I don't remember off the top of my head whether it's like if you tally the nation states that vote a certain way, those populations that they represent overpower in terms of pure tally, pure number, compared to those that are against Russia's invasion or whatever. I forget if it's like that stark, but like it wouldn't surprise me if like the numbers ultimately come down to something like 50-50, right? So if you're not from the West, you like this kind of argument, right? You want to be able to do things your own way, especially if just materially, historically, your state kind of requires it, right? Like the reason why, for instance, Russia wouldn't allow protests is it's not because they're sort of like innately, you see a lot of these like disgusting arguments going around about like there is something in the Russian spirit, in the Russian blood. These like very Orientalist fucking arguments, right? There's something in the Russian blood that prevents them, right, from having liberal aspirations, right? They fear that. They're against it. That's not what they want. Realistically, the reason why something like protests wouldn't be tolerated in Russia is because the leadership is making the calculation, and you don't have to agree with this calculation, right? And I definitely don't agree with it, simply because there's definitely some room to maneuver here. But the calculation is something along the lines of, look, liberal democracies, right? They're not going to say this openly, right? But like I know this is what they're thinking. Liberal democracies like the United States, they tend to be stable. Like we could talk shit all you want about the United States, but it's far more stable than a place like Russia, just innately, right? Just again, like our states, like yes, we have a federation of states, but they're much less, they're much less like distinct than what's going on in Russia. And damn, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so like we have this federation, right? And we could brook a lot of protest movements, right? A protest movement is not going to topple a government, right? Maybe like when you go to an election, protests might be a sort of they might sort of tell you where elections are going to swing, but we're not really in the position to topple governments, right? We don't have enough problems as a society in America to create that, right? And even those that could sort of arguably, you know, even if they have a claim to violence against America, like, you know, Native American groups or whatever, given the way they've been treated historically and to this day, right? Like, it's hard for me to like sit here and say, well, they have no actual legitimate claims to violence against the state. Like, it would be very hard to make that argument, right? Especially given the nature of like America's Revolutionary War, right? Like, we're sort of about that, aren't we? But in the present day, right, for various reasons, that generally is not what occurs in America. In Russia, though, you could have a secessionist movement. You had a secessionist movement in the 90s, right? You had multiple secessionist movements in the 90s. And you have, to this day, tons of resentments that are far deeper than the kind of, you know, state-level resentments that we have in America. So from Putin's perspective, from Xi Jinping's perspective, they would say, you know what? The West can brook protests. They could deal with it. We can't, right? For us, it's going to be the toppling of a regime. And it's not just the toppling of a regime with this kind of like, you know, obviously there's a lot of selfishness there, right? Like, obviously, like, Xi wants to be in power, Putin wants to be in power, he wants whoever, you know, their, you know, successors to be, they want them to be in power, they want them to have legitimacy, they want to see the country go in whatever direction they sort of have preformed in their heads. But beyond that kind of like base selfishness that all leaders would have, and some leaders have more of it than others, there's the very real idea that if you have a fracture of a large and historical nation state, that will create a lot of chaos, okay? I mean, the USSR was dissolved on a voluntary basis with the international community there. They voted on Russia being the successor state to the USSR. Russia allowed, right? I mean, allowed, right, in scare quotes, because you're allowed because you have no choice. But, you know, they sort of allowed this situation where, you know, things just kind of like, you know, more or less like dissolved in orderly fashion, let's call it. But even so, even with a semi-orderly dissolution, again, tons of secessionist movements within Russia, even after like the international community agreed upon Russia's borders, agreed upon, you know, who would be within the Russian Federation, what republics, like they, you know, they accepted the Russian Constitution, especially like when you recognize a state, right, you recognize more or less their ways of doing things, right? You sort of recognize their constitution in some ways. Let me make sure that I didn't, okay, good. Because last time when I was doing this, I accidentally messed up my camera. But yeah, so like it all proceeded in orderly fashion, more or less. And yet, even in that situation, you had secession, you had tons of poverty, you had tons of violence, right? You had some of these oblasts in Russia, right? We had murder rates that were like at the level of the Wild Wild West, right? Which was like, it's much worse than anything that's going on in America right now. Even if you go into like the worst neighborhood in America, right? It's probably not going to be, just strictly speaking, the kind of war zone that the Wild West was, you know, America's frontiers. So, but you know, but that's what occurred, right? And there's no reason to assume that if Russia dissolves right now, like people like on Twitter or whatever, they're talking about, we need to, you know, decolonize Russia. Like, it's not even that even conceptually I'm even sort of like against that, right? It's more so that I saw how that was treated by the West in the 90s, right? They said, this dissolution is going to be good for you. We'll do these market reforms. And instead, all you had for a decade was like more or less a non-functional state, right? You had to have somebody like that come out and say, we're going to have a dictatorship of the law, you know? We needed somebody like that. And you know, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it from the perspective of the Russian, right? This is why they voted for Putin. This is why he was able to hold on to power for as long as he had, right? Because he established a ton of legitimacy, right? Same thing with Xi, right? He has more legitimacy in the eyes of Chinese than any American president has in the eyes of Americans. And this might sound silly to us, but that's because we're used to a very nice standard of living, right? We're used to not too much change happening. So if China could industrialize as rapidly as it had, right, over the course of decades, it's, there's going to be a ton of legitimacy there, right? Same thing with Russia. If you're able to get all of the cartels under control and essentially be your own cartel, right? Your own cartel. You're the head of all these criminal cartels now. You are now the chief enforcer, right? You are the mob boss. That's going to bring a ton of legitimacy, right, to the eyes of Russian citizens, because they actually feel, right? They feel what it was like in the 90s or even the 80s, and they feel the differences between then and now. So again, you know, just to wrap up this part of it, from the Russian perspective, from the Chinese perspective, probably later on we're going to see this in, like, you know, the Indian perspective. Stability is far preferable to liberalism at a time when liberalism can't do anything except like a fractured state, right? Like, again, just to do that 90s comparison, right? Russia remembers what this was, right? They said dissolve and this is going to be all good, it's going to be orderly, it's going to be better. But the West didn't come with a no strings attached aid package. It didn't do anything about the dissolution of state power. And there's no reason to think that if there's a, let's call it, decolonization of Russia, there's no reason to think that the same things won't repeat, right? And just like back to just like the broader idea of multiculturalism specifically, it's kind of like when you see like during the mobilization, right? Dagestan has some protests, like they were mild, right? Like you see some videos going around, but it's not major. But they still have resentments, right? They're less developed than the rest of the country, right? Than Russia proper. And because of that, you're going to have the resentments. And when I think to, you know, this idea of like we want an alternative to the West, like I wish Russia could provide it, right? I want an alternative to the West, right? I wish Russia could provide it. I wish any country, like it doesn't have to be Russia. Like I wish when China has its own kind of like, you know, propaganda about how it's going to treat its subjects or whatever, I wish I could believe that too. But instead, I look at something like the Russia-Ukraine war, and you don't even have to like have a negative view of the war, right, for you to take this particular position. But when I see the fact that if you're a Dagestani, your chances of dying in combat is like, you know, like 5 to 10 times higher than an ethnic Russian, well, that lets me know that whatever thing that you're talking about, like multiculturalism, like whatever you want to say, like is it really an alternative to the West, or is it just hypocrisy, right? Again, eventually we're going to have some kind of broader world federation, right? We're going to have a broader world government. I don't think it's ever going to be, you know, the world government in the strict sense, but we're going to get more and more federated. Some of the UN hypocrisies that we see, right, they're going to disappear. But it cannot be along the lines of whatever Russia is proposing, whatever China is proposing, or whatever the West is proposing, because they're all hypocrites, right? I have no reason to think, that any nation state like is anything other than just like a total, you know, like knot of hypocrisies. I haven't seen that, right? I haven't seen power just like willingly be nice, right? Again, if you're a Dagestani and you're talking about multiculturalism and you're sort of puffing this up, why do you have such a high chance of dying in this war? What are they doing to you? Are they sending you first to be the first to be killed in combat? And after your body is used to like essentially mop up to soften like whatever is going on in the front lines, then, you know, the ethnic Russians come in, like what is going on exactly? There's something going on there, right? We don't know you know, I don't know the exact mechanism, but there's something going on there. And, you know, like this idea of like this third Rome, right? The concept of like a Russian third Rome, like it doesn't matter whether it's like religious or non-religious, like whether it's like secular, whether it's communist, right? Whether it's going to be like explicitly liberal. I saw Aleksandr Dugin's debate, for instance, with like some like typical like Western liberal, some like French guy. I don't remember who he was, but he was asked about the Ukraine war in 2014, right, when the annexation of Crimea first happened, and he was like, "What I would say is we didn't go far enough, right? We needed to secure all of Ukraine so that Ukraine could experience a renewal." And I think that's when everything sort of clicked for me, right? Because I thought, well, how different is this discussion from what I heard from, you know, the project for the new American century? We're going to do all these regime change wars. We're going to change the nature of what's going on in the Middle East because we want them to have a renewal. Of course, it's couched in liberal language. It's all that. Russia's couching it its own language, but the root cause is still the same. The desires are still the same, right? I have no reason to think that it's going to be any different in one situation or the next, right? They're just using different words, right? And they think it's a different concept simply because it's a different set of words, but it's not, right? It is essentially all the same, right? I want to see some actions leading to something worthwhile, not just nice words, right? The renewal of Ukraine, he called it spiritual renewal. The spiritual renewal of Ukraine. Oh, okay. In America, we don't talk about spiritual renewals. We talk about liberal, secular renewals. We talk about democracy. That's our religion. Your religion is orthodoxy. And you think that this is necessarily preferable simply because it's not the West. And it doesn't work like that, right? These loci of power, they all want the same thing. And you know, it's tough watching this, especially with the knowledge that, you know, so much of what Russia or China says about America is correct, right? And it's tough knowing that because I know they're not saying that necessarily from the best place, right? They're not saying that in a way that will help their new subjects, right? And you know, there's also some like little minor things I want to wrap up before I go here. It's kind of dark. I'm picking up some noodles, and if you're wondering how the hell does Jamaica Queens have some of the best noodles in all of New York City, I would tell you that you haven't been paying attention, huh? But anyway, you know, growing up, let's just say Russian for the sake of ease, and even in New York City, like a very liberal place, right? We're all tolerant of immigrants, blah, blah, blah. I don't think people really understand, unless you are in fact an immigrant, you don't really know how easy it is to be living in America and just like as a child, right, like a new immigrant, and just have a ton of like conflicting feelings about yourself, right? Self-hatreds that are being cultivated, even if it's not, you know, even if it's not for the sake, even if it's not like some cruel thing that's going on at the behest of the state. Still, right? Like, I mean, even if you're completely surrounded, like I was completely surrounded by immigrant kids, other Russians, you know, Pakistanis, lots of Colombian kids, Chinese kids, everybody, right? Egyptian kids. These were my neighbors, right? This was like the norm. But even so, I distinctly remember feeling, you know, kind of like shame for being from anywhere other than the United States, right? The United States is the new thing. This is where you are now, right? And I can't point to any explicit messaging that was going on, but implicitly there's something always there, right? There is something happening in that way. So, you know, this broader idea of multiculturalism and what would that look like, right? There's a lot of work that everybody has to do. even in an allegedly tolerant place like America, you're going to grow up, feeling that type of way. And I'm sure that if you are in a Russian republic, that's probably multiplied tenfold, right? If you know for a fact that everybody around you is dying because of this war, and it all seems to fracture in ethnic lines, right? There's something deeper going on that the state doesn't want to talk about. So when I think of like, what is Russia? From the perspective of a Russian, one that is granted transplanted to America and can see things from like a different set of eyes, but also somebody that, like I don't buy the Western narrative on a lot of things. I don't buy the Western narrative on Russia, Ukraine. I don't buy the Western narrative of itself. I don't buy the Russian narrative of itself. I don't buy the Chinese narrative of itself. And that's kind of the place where you want to come from at everything, right? But this idea of what is Russia, I think one of the best case scenarios that I see going forward is, I think, like the novel I'm working on now, Tinker Toys, there's this kind of like weird poetic justice that occurs where it takes place a century from now. And Russia is ascendant purely by accident, right? Like there's nothing that Russia is doing right now that I would consider, for instance, to be very climate friendly. I mean, it is an oil state, right? The reason why it is able to survive, right, is because of these kinds of resources. But it also has a ton of land, right? Most of it is not inhabited. It can potentially be inhabited, especially as the earth warms up a little bit and you get a little more greenery in some of these places. You have some high rises, right? Everybody's living in high rises. I can imagine Russia in the future, especially if we don't get climate change under control. I can imagine it being one of the chief population centers of the world, right? And for it to thrive and survive in that context as a chief population center, like it's going to need a different kind of government, right? It's going to need a different set of stories about itself. It can't at that point simply be like, oh, we're just an alternative to the West, right? Because everything's going to be changed at that point. But it's I would find that to be a sort of like fascinating kind of thing where due to no effort of its own, right? Due to no effort of its own, it becomes ascendant, right? Simply because like the planet is changing and it's sort of like caught up in history in this way. A more kind of short-term scenario that I see is the containment of China, right? America is going to have to contain China pretty soon. It's already started, right? Like I was kind of like laughing. I remember all through 2020 when some friends I have, they were more conservative than me, and they were like, if Trump leaves office, that's it. Like Biden's not going to try to do anything about China. And I was like, no, the radical party always sets the agenda. And guess what? The Republicans are the radical party. They started the trade wars. They started all this, China politicking, and that's not only going to continue; it's going to accelerate. And what do you know? Some of the harshest measures thus far taken against China they did not come from Trump. They came from Biden. And it doesn't matter that there's like, oh, there's conflicts of interest, or like, what is the Biden family doing in China? Like, it doesn't matter, right? That's all going to get subsumed by geopolitical reality. So the containment of China has begun. I'm not, taking a position as to whether or not it's going to be successful, but what I will say is, in the near future, this three-part alliance that's going on, Iran, China, and Russia, what I imagine happening is Russia forms an alliance with China. China eventually, I would assume, is either tries to betray Russia, right, by sort of like aspirations on Siberia. If it feels like it can do so, right, it won't do it if it can't, right? But if there's an opportunity, of course, it's going to take it. Or Russia is going to be the first to betray China and go with America, right? America is going to have to, like, we keep kicking this can down the road, but eventually America is going to need a true, robust alliance with Russia. And Iran's probably going to be part of this alliance too, right? It's going to be a fairly different world. Personally, I would look forward to that world. I want to easily visit Russia again, right? I have nice memories of St. Petersburg, right? The White Knights. But short term, this is what I see going on. Long term, it will be fascinating again if, through no effort of its own, Russia and Canada are ascendant. Little parts of South America are ascendant. They didn't do anything, they just existed. They just happened to have the right geography. And there's like a metaphor there for the human condition, isn't there? There's a metaphor there for how we process things, how we always leave everything to the last minute, how we sort of like, assume, that fate is fate, can't do much about it. Anyway, I'm gonna end it here. I'm gonna pick up my food and hopefully I'll upload this tonight. So there are actually a couple things that I forgot to say last night, plus a few more things that came to my attention as I was going to sleep. So there was a tweet that I saw yesterday. Well, there's a few tweets I'm going to talk about, but one thing I saw yesterday from one of these Russian accounts, it was like one of these like funny little memes that they do. And in this particular case, it was just this like, big, like burly Russian guy who seemed to be in very friendly relations with a bear, right? It seemed like he trained him. I think it was shirtless, I don't remember, but basically the idea was to communicate that this notion of like Russian masculinity. And in the background, what you heard playing was not the Russian national anthem, not even the Soviet national anthem, but a kind of secondary de facto national anthem that the Soviet Union undertook 2 days after the invasion of the USSR by Germany. There was a song that was written that became very famous, and in some circles maybe you could say even more famous than the national anthem. Something like "Вставай, страна огромная," right? Arise, enormous nation, right? It was a war song. And coupling these two things together, right? So these are my observations about these kinds of images that get communicated, what they might mean. First of all, back to this idea of Aleksandr Dugin and Russia potentially offering something other than what the West offers, right? This idea of just like the most trite version of masculinity that you could imagine, right? Granted, there's like a Russian hue to it. Not many Americans are forming bonding relationships with bears. But nonetheless, it is still a very trite conception of masculinity. You see, broad spectrum of pretty, right-wing sort of views on social issues. And it's not, first of all, it's not an alternative to the West because despite Aleksandr Dugin claiming that he had, found a fourth political theory, meaning let's transcend Marxism, let's transcend fascism, let's transcend liberalism, I'm not convinced that anyone, anytime soon, is ever going to really transcend liberalism. Now, maybe you could adopt a little bit of a different logic, superficially from American-style liberalism. But so far, what Russia has done is it has been in a reactionary state, and this is kind of going back even before, right, before the Bolshevik Revolution. You're not able to so easily escape this logic of liberalism, right? Whether it's like American liberals that very cynically use gay issues, right, trans issues, whatever, and you see the kind of conservative reactions and the cynical ways that they respond to all this stuff. Russia feels the need to do the same exact thing, right? In liberal logic, the reason why these things are inevitable is simply because liberalism cannot provide for all in the kind of comprehensive way that it claims to be able to do, right? It has not demonstrated its ability to do that. right? Whether it's domestically, right? We see people that are constantly under the heel of the state, or just like social forces more broadly, or internationally, right? So much of our wealth has come from either, you know, slavery in the past, trade deals that benefit us more than others, a kind of like de facto slavery going on in the global south, right? The estimates are as high as 150 trillion has been transferred from the pockets of the south to the north, right, over a long enough span of time. So that's the kind of contradiction of liberalism, right? It makes these promises that it cannot actually uphold thus far. And a similar dynamic, right, is going on in Russia, right? What it promises in terms of multiculturalism, what it promises in terms of fairness, what it promises in terms of alternatives, it can't actually meet those promises, right? Superficially, it is illiberal, right? Superficially, it looks like, you know, we are doing something different from the West. But that underpinning logic, right, that I think ought to be transcended by any kind of system they might undertake, that is still in place, okay? And seeing that kind of social messaging, right, the kind of like tritest possible conception of masculinity being pushed forward as this is the way forward, right? So again, there's that kind of native hypocrisy, the same kind of native hypocrisy that might exist in the liberal strain that's always being recreated some way, right? So again, I totally reject the notion that Russia, that China, whoever, is offering a genuine alternative. I think alternatives will come and they must come, right? I'm not here just boosting what the West does, but I don't want it to look like what the West does. I don't want it to look like what Russia does. I don't want it to look, you know, pretty much like anything at present now, right? I want something new, genuinely different. And the fourth political theory, it is not. I was actually thinking maybe I should do a stream about that book, but I'm honestly not very impressed, right? I was expecting more. I was expecting more sophistication in the arguments and not being able to have an objection on literally, you know, every paragraph that I read. So that's the first part. The second part, going back to that video. So obviously World War II plays a very important role in Russian history, European history. It's played an important role in Soviet propaganda. I don't mean that necessarily in a negative sense, right? When I use the word propaganda, in this video and elsewhere, I don't necessarily do so in the pejorative sense, right? Oftentimes when people say propaganda, they mean false information. And the Soviet use of World War II was not false information, right? It was, it is a fact that 1/6 of Russians died on account of World War II, right? That is a tremendous sacrifice. 1/4 of Belarusians, right, in my country, 1/4 of Belarusians died during World War II, right? That is a tremendous sacrifice. The sacrifices that the USSR made as a whole were far vaster than the sacrifices that the West made overall, right? And I know like some people might now start objecting, oh, but wait, you know, there was that pact that Stalin had with Hitler. You know, he was essentially a collaborator at the beginning and he only turned against him during an invasion, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you could certainly make those kinds of objections, I would, but you're going to have to then make the same objections across the board, because even as all this was going on, right, writers like Stefan Zweig, who wrote this book, The World of Yesterday, I remember reading that when I was maybe like, maybe it was in college or maybe before college, and he was making this point that, look, this was like before the Holocaust was even known, right? This is just like when Hitler came into power. And Zweig was observing what was going on. He was like, this country did not have this sort of military. We did not have this level of wealth. Where's all of this coming from, right? It has to be coming from somewhere, and it's not just native. And now, of course, we know the extent to which, you know, companies did business with Hitler, right? We know that collaboration is sort of like baked into the system. Maybe not in the sort of explicit way of establishing these kinds of pacts, but generally speaking, right, collaboration was built into the system. This is one of the underpinning, piece of logic to liberalism, right? You're gonna try to make as many deals as possible to, according to the logic of the liberal order, make things more democratic or perhaps get them on your side somehow. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but what that means is you're gonna have plenty of examples where you try to do this and it fails, right? Or it could be just, as cynical as just pure profit taking, which is what it is the majority of times, and which is what was going on during, or rather before World War II, right? So if you want to, object to Russia's use of World War II as empty propaganda, the same thing is applicable to the rest of the world, right? So we're back to, therefore, to square one. And again, I'm going to make the claim that the Russian sacrifice in World War II was tremendous. And at this point, right, it's now almost a century, right? It's going to be now almost a century after World War II. It's now getting forgotten. The people that fought in World War II, such as two of my grandfathers, right? Very few people are alive now who fought in World War II at this point. So all that is getting forgotten. Now, putting that aside for a second, the next point I would raise is, okay, so World War II happened. This is the Russian sacrifice. It is still part of Russian propaganda. How long can you rest on those laurels? You know what I mean? That's not to discount Russian sacrifices. That's not to discount everything that happened. But again, you can't point to the same thing over and over and over again, because I don't allow US to do that. US has done plenty of good things. American behavior right after World War II, I think, was correct, right? I think the reconstruction of Europe, specifically Germany, the idea was we don't want another Versailles situation. We're going to allow Germany to have a successor state that we recognize, that we start anew with, and we're going to build them up. We're going to make sure there aren't the kind of resentments that would lead to another kind of Hitler situation. So America has definitely played lots of positive roles in the world. At the same time, I do not allow America to point to this or point to that when I discuss Vietnam, when I discuss Iraq, when I discuss Afghanistan, when I discuss Israel-Palestine, when I discuss all these things that are now, if you're outside of the West, these are things that are well known to you, right? Because they're part of your propaganda, your upbringing. And again, propaganda, not in the pejorative sense, because what I just listed, those things were not positives, were they? Right? Libya was not a positive. But it's propaganda in the sense that nation states are using American misbehavior to prop up their own systems, their own so-called alternatives. And America makes it very, very easy for that to happen. Very easy for that to happen. It's easy for that to happen because America just can't control itself, right? So back to Russia now. We are at a point, like it or not, even if it's offensive to say, don't denigrate, the memory of the Holocaust, the memory of Russian sacrifices, blah, blah, blah. But it's just a fact of life that after a while, we are getting those diminishing returns, okay? We are at a point of diminishing returns. And Russian identity has to find something else now, right? It can't just keep tapping World War II forever. Those soldiers are dying or dead. People now growing up, they don't know anything. They don't remember anything. What are you going to offer to them now, right? Whether in art or whatever, you're always as good as your last book, your last article, your last poem. Right? With nation states, the stakes geopolitically I don't want to say they're necessarily higher, right? I don't want to denigrate art. But the stakes are different, right? And that renewal is, you know, even more important in some respects. Next thing I'm going to say is to specifically turn to, well, also let me just give a brief comment on that song, Vstavai, Strana Ogromnaya. As an artist, right, I could like critique the use of, you know, it's not like necessarily, it's not like very well written or anything. Although as a Russian, it's very fun to listen to. But I have never seen a more effective war song, right? It truly is probably like the most effective war song ever written. And again, that's not even necessarily because of the lyrics themselves. Like there's something, it seems like it came about due to like this like, you know, confluence of events, right? You have the invasion, literally 2 days later, the song is written, it's composed, and something about it, their rhythms, right? Something about what it does. And I don't know if it's simply because like I have this like emotional bias in being Russian or whatever, but you know, when I see like other people's comments, if you look at some of the various renditions of the song on YouTube or whatever, right, all the comments are the same, right? They're like, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not this, I'm not that, but damn, this shit makes me want to fight on behalf of the Soviet Union. So it's still, you know, it's still very effective propaganda, like this kind of music, this kind of art. And I think like any kind of Russian renewal, any kind of new Russian identity, it's gonna have to ultimately tap its, specifically its rich cultural legacy, right? Yesterday, as I was walking home, I discovered yet another just truly flat out great song by Vladimir Vysotsky. I was listening to it, I was thinking about the lyrics. It's called Chihaya Kulia, which is kind of like another person's rut or something like that. I'm actually going to add it to the big video that I'm doing on Russian music, right? Translate it so you guys know, right, what I mean when I say Russian music tends to have some of the best written songs that I've ever come across. And renewal has to come from that, but you know, thus far, I'm not sure how conducive Russia right now is to the arts, right? And it's the same kind of problem, right? We would have the same problem in the West, right? The West is not conducive to the arts right now. The concerns are so many-sided. The concerns are all about, you know, things that are essentially so antithetical to the arts, and Russia is not going to be exempt from this, I don't think, right? There's something, you know, it's not just like a political thing, right? It's not just there's repression, because I mean there's repression in the Soviet Union, but actually that actually drove tons of wonderful writing. So there's something in the air right now. There's something else going on that has repressed the artistic instinct, that has changed the artistic instinct from an artistic one to something else altogether, right? Where people confuse the artistic instinct with other things. And they think that they're tapping it, they think that they're engaging it, but they're not. Anyway, so the next thing I want to talk about is Ukraine, right? In relation to Russia, and something that I saw last night. I guess this was the perfect way to go to bed. So Zelensky tweeted after the Israeli elections, congratulating Netanyahu in Israel for the win. And actually, I have it right here. When I saw the tweet, the phrasing was honestly so over the top and so, you know, just obviously wrong, right? In terms of like if you know anything about Israel-Palestine, that I thought it was actually like one of those joke accounts. There's like, you know, joke like political accounts all the time, whether it's like a fake Biden account, a fake Zelensky account. I thought it was like a fake account, right? Because I thought like somebody was just doing satire. And it was something like, This is what he said. It's always important to see real democracy in action. We know that Israel is not a democracy, right? We know that superficially it's a democracy, but that doesn't mean anything, right? We know that it's not a democracy. We know that tons of the population are literally in apartheid conditions. We know this is what's going on. This was paired with another video that I saw from, like around the same time, which was a bunch of Jewish protesters in Israel. I don't know exactly what they're even fucking protesting. Maybe it's just a demonstration of some sort of support, right? Because what the hell do you have to protest as an Israeli Jew, right? Your chances of getting, like a lot of Israeli Jews complain about, like, well, what about terrorism? What about this? What about that? If you are a Jew living in Brooklyn, guess what? Your chances of getting murdered, right, dying from a violent cause, is so much higher than your chances of the same, including terrorism, if you were just to move to Israel, right? So Israel is actually one of the safest places for Jews on the planet. That is a fact. It's been this way for a long, long time. And so, like, when this tweet goes out, you have to, like, stop and think, right? People outside of the West are observing this, right? There's a huge population of people that you never get to hear from, right? You assume they don't exist, right? They're the ones quietly giving you a proper standard of living, right? Off of their backs. And they're watching, right? They watch the propaganda unfold. They watch Western claims about democracy. They watch Western claims about the Russia-Ukraine war. And then they see Zelensky and Saudi Arabia and others forming alliances with a nation state that is exactly the opposite of what these claims entail. And that's reality to them. And it reminds me of this one, it wasn't even an argument because he never responded, but I remember one time I did some article about, like, there was like men's rights activism adjacent. And, if you follow some of my work, you know that I'm sympathetic to many of the claims that MRAs make. My problem with MRAs is they're so willing, they're too willing to demand their rights on the backs of others, right? That's really what the issue is. And I remember this one guy showed up, Dean Esme was his name, and he left this, like, nasty comment, like, I was reading this article and I thought you were making good points, and then you had to, like, say, bad shit about MRA. But then I checked his website, right? I think it was called, like, A Place for Men or something. One of the bigger men's rights activist websites. And the top article was something like, if you think Saudi Arabian women have it bad, wait till you see how bad the men have it, right? Just basically making the claim that Saudi Arabian men are doing worse than Saudi Arabian women. This is a preposterous thing to say, first of all, but it just goes to this idea of you are willing to create rights, right, and self-determination for yourself upon the backs of others. When that happens, your rights are illegitimate. Other people then have some basis, maybe not a perfect basis, but some basis for saying that you have no justification and no right for your rights. Where did you get these rights? Where did they come from? Rights have to be enforced by a nation state. Rights have to be enforced by power. Rights have to be enforced, period. Where did they come from? Are they coming off of the backs of Saudi Arabian women? Is that how we're supposed to view your men's rights? The same question should be posed to Zelensky. National self-determination, perfectly legitimate, fine. Is it going to come off of the backs of Palestinians? Because Israeli self-determination literally comes off of the backs of Palestinians. There was a bunch of land that people were living on, and guess what? Some magical events occur, And those people live there no longer, and they're replaced with somebody else. Literally off of the backs of Palestinians, these rights were constructed. Israel is a powerful state. It is the leading military power in the Middle East. It's able to be that way because of the United States. The US is shipping arms to Ukraine. Israel, I'm not sure exactly if Israel has been shipping arms to Ukraine, but it wouldn't surprise me. But if that's the case, some level of your own national self-determination, your own rights, your own claims to, I'm defending my people against an invasion, that comes on the backs of someone else's invasion, someone else's property, someone else's national self-determination. Because as much as I would criticize Russian self-conception, Russian statehood, Russian ideas of kind of like the entire world, let's say, just the Russian point of view, I gotta be honest, the way that Ukrainian national identity was forged, the way that it came to the fore, was also incredibly shameful, was it not? And part of this is, it is historical accident that here we have, this place, Ukraine. It does not want to be under the thumb of the USSR. It has resentments during World War II about the great famines and the Holodomor and all of that. So when Nazis invaded Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainians who, I'm not sure to what extent they even understood what was happening in terms of the Holocaust, but many Ukrainians saw Nazis as liberators, right? Because they're like, all right, we're being invaded by, and in fact, many Nazis did treat Ukrainians as, all right, so if they're going to view us as liberators, let us get them on our side, right? So they were given weapons, they were trained. Bandera, who is a national hero in Ukraine, he was a Nazi collaborator, right? He was personally responsible for the deaths of at least thousands, maybe tens of thousands or even more, Jews, Russians, Poles, perhaps even other Ukrainians that he might have found undesirable in some way. And look, I know that you could separate the forging of the Ukrainian national identity from the kind of more generic self-determination and feelings like that lots of ordinary Ukrainians might have, right? There's plenty of educated Ukrainians that have nothing to do with National Socialist ideology. But this is the sort of starting context. And that is traumatizing to Ukraine. Okay? Think of the various traumas that Ukraine had to go through. USSR, famines, Nazism, war again and again and again, right? So any kind of renewal, right? And this is why when Aleksandr Dugin says things like, we need to have a spiritual renewal in Ukraine, a lot of Russians are going to look at that and guess what? They're going to believe it because they're going to say, our national identity was forged off of resistance to Hitler. This national identity was in part forged by Nazi collaboration. And I mean, to this day, right, we could separate the kind of hard right-wingers in Ukraine that are agitating versus the kind of more generic sort of demonstrators you might find, typical people, whatever. But those that are providing, the arms and the training and the actual power, right? Because a demonstration without physical power is what? It's bullshit, right? It doesn't actually matter, right? This is why the Capitol riots, people were so, up in arms, right? Because there was, it wasn't power in the kind of, it wasn't power in the kind of, hard arms kind of way, but there was this demonstration of violence, right? And in Ukraine, all the right-wing groups and the neo-Nazi groups, they are the ones that took credit. Whether or not they deserve that credit, they did take credit for Maidan. They were, integrated into the armed forces. Some of them have been disciplined in various ways. right? So they're not so like openly like neo-Nazi or whatever. But the fact remains, like, this is a part of Ukrainian national identity, and that is traumatizing to people that are living there. You do not want this to be part of your identity. If Zelensky is out there and he's forging alliances with places like Israel, which is doing the same thing, right? You got your national identity on the backs of who, right? You were resisting the USSR on the backs of who? Or whom? You're getting shipments, or might be getting shipments in the future from Israel on the backs of whom? You can't have a healthy conception of yourself long term if this is just how it all works, right? You need something else. You need something other. And people outside of the West are watching. Which way is Ukraine going to go? Is it going to throw this bullshit history off? Is it going to try something different? Is it going to try something new? Russia's not really willing to try anything new, right? It's just kind of doing the same old fucking shit, as always. Ukraine seems to be doing the same old fucking shit, as always. America's doing the same old fucking shit, as always. Last thing I want to say is, back to this idea of like a traumatized population. During the Budapest Memorandum, all right, so during the Budapest Memorandum, right, we have these security guarantees that were made to Ukraine, to Kazakhstan, to Belarus, right, in exchange for giving up their nukes, right? The USSR had nukes, and some of the locations were like in the USSR, were like in some of those republics, right? When you read the text of this memorandum, there's a few things that go into it. This is like from 1994. The West and Russia are guaranteeing security, right, sovereignty and all of that to these new states that are emerging after the collapse of the USSR. A secondary point is the United States, right, is offering security guarantees to Ukraine. Another point is neither Russia nor the West are allowed to meddle in Ukraine. Whether this is like taking on trade deals that are way too, they're just, you know, that break too much in one direction versus the other. Like, you weren't supposed to do that. The idea in 1994, when this was still fresh in people's minds, when people were more sensitive to the fact that there are fractures in Ukraine, right? The East, pretty much from the very beginning, right? We had demonstrations against the government in Kyiv, right? They were saying that it's too centralized, right? We didn't want to be under the heel of Moscow. We now don't want to be under the heel of Kyiv, right? Russia obviously is trying to exploit those differences, you know, from the beginning to the extent that it could. But that was fresh in people's minds then, right? People understood that these fractures were occurring. You cannot have a situation where you have such a powerful neighbor, or like right next to you, and you're suddenly, you know, going, you know, you're being either put under their thumb or under the thumb of the West. Like, that's not going to be healthy, specifically to Ukraine, right? Forget about Russia, forget about the West, right? What about Ukraine, right? We always have these like questions again and again. You know, who's going to be controlling Ukraine? Are we going to have Ukraine as America's vassal, or is it going to be Russia's vassal? What about an independent Ukraine that has wealth and power, right, based on positive sum relationships equally with Russia and the West, right? And of course, like, those security guarantees from the Budapest Memorandum, like, what do they actually mean, right? Like, was the United States going to go to war over Ukraine ever? And if not, what is the nature of these guarantees? What is the nature of those guarantees if you're not willing to go to war? It doesn't make any sense, you know? Like, essentially, Ukraine gave up its nukes for nothing. And, you know, little by little, right, both of these forces are pulling on the arm of Ukraine. And to get back to Zelensky for a second, like back to this idea of like Ukrainian self-identity. I mean, he was elected specifically to like on a peace platform, right? And all places like elected him, right? All places were happy to have him. They elected him on a peace platform. Need I remind you that the peace platform, as recognized, in 2015, by the time they would get the Minsk II agreements, one of the provisions was you are required under international law, right? This is what it states, to have elections in the Donbass. Now, they need to be done in a way that it's not just like, a Russian election, whatever that means. And Zelensky said, you know what? Yes, I was elected to end this war. I was elected to end it peacefully, not by military means. That's the other thing. It was to end the war peacefully, right? To put into play, right, all the sort of provisions of Minsk II. And he was supposed to call, and he wanted to call, elections in the Donbass under specifically the following conditions. International observers. Number two, a withdrawal of Russian forces, right? You could finally stop shelling the Donbass, right, from the Ukrainian side. And Russian forces are disengaging as well. That seems rational to me, right? Looking from the outside, if you want to talk about like an end to war. But at the same time, think back to what I said about those right-wing forces, the ones that took credit for Maidan, the ones that actually provided the physical muscle during the demonstrations, and the ones that were given so much respect, they were given so much renewed admiration, right, after Maidan, because it was true, they were the ones providing the muscle. This was, recognized by ordinary Ukrainians, even if they might not like some of the ideologies or the neo-Nazism or whatever. Those same forces are now demonstrating against Zelensky at the end of 2019 because he's offering to hold elections in the Donbass because he wants to implement Minsk II. Again, the requirement of international law is that you implement those elections under the conditions that were stated. And even if you believe that you want something more, maybe, I don't know if there were provisions, for instance, like, okay, many of the Ukrainians that are ethnic Ukrainians and speak Ukrainian that fled the Donbass when the war started, maybe we could have some of them return so they could be part of the vote too, right? Refugees under the UN have a right of return. So I think it would be sensible if at least that is attempted, right? But that's the thing, whether or not you think that's reasonable, personally, I doubt many Ukrainians would ever want to go back to the Donbass. It's just, it was always a fucked up place to live, even before the annexation of Crimea happened. But you have to try something, right? But instead, Zelensky gives in, despite knowing his obligations under the law, he gives in to these right-wing factions that are just, they're just totally fucking out of control. You see these guys in videos from 2019, 2020. Zelensky is out there in the fucking battlefield and he's telling Azov, stop shelling, stop your operations now. And they're telling him no. They're telling him, fuck you. How is that even possible? How do you have a nation state where the commander-in-chief gives an order to stop a certain military operation or to stop even one instantiation, one aspect of that military operation, and they're telling him to fuck off? That is not a functional nation state. That is not conducive to a positive Ukrainian identity that is separate from its Nazi roots, that is separate from Russian interference, Russian meddling, that is separate from Western designs upon Ukraine. Right? You can't have self-respect. You can't have a national identity under those circumstances. And to the extent that Russia is out there feeding this, sowing more divisions, and also just, obviously they are justifiably miffed, by everything that I just described, right? Clearly, if you take my reading of the event says like, all right, this is what occurred. Clearly you do, like you would say that, okay, they have some justification to be upset. They have justification to view this or that as an escalation. Some might even, justify military action because of this. It's toxic to Russia, right? It's toxic to Ukraine. This is not the start of any kind of positive identity. But the idea that the West, as like, the sort of like the leading power in the world, is being totally, absent from these discussions, right? That is really fascinating, especially in terms of this whole like notion of, freedom of speech in the West. You can't bring America outside of this discussion, right? It has to be part of the discussion. It has to be part of what's going on. It has to be, I mean, again, Brzezinski himself, he said in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, we could keep pushing EU expansion, we could keep pushing NATO expansion, fine, and we could do it even if Russia complains. And in fact, he recommended exactly that. Even if Russia complains about the EU, even if they complain about NATO, let's keep pushing, but let's not do this in totally naked fashion without being rational about it. If we're pushing NATO and EU, it has to be under the context of a wider security arrangement with Russia, so they could feel, even if they're not part of NATO, at least part in some way of Europe, part of, the broader security guarantees, and that they don't view expansion as territorial infringement, as meddling, as interference, right? Because we Americans, Putin runs some fucking bots in 2016, and Hillary Clinton starts crying for the next 4 years that the election was stolen. Right? The idea of like the stolen election, right, back in like 2020, right? The roots of that obviously go further back, right? Not that it starts necessarily with Hillary Clinton herself, but they go back, right? We have now a standard of conduct for, okay, if you want to contest an election via false claims, this is how you do it. We have a playbook, right? And it's going back a while now. So, this was supposed to be kind of this wider sort of thing. And if Brzezinski says, we can push in this way, but it has to be done on a rational basis that continually integrates Russia more and more and more into the West. And he finishes that section by saying, if we fail to do this, not only would it be a catastrophic failure, but we will also see an alliance between Russia, Iran, and China. And what do you know? Has that catastrophic failure occurred? Brzezinski is a representation of liberal elite thinking at the time. He admits, of course he's dead now, but using the book as a guide, this would be an admission, very much so, that that was a failed policy. If that was a failed policy, and if that failure was a Western failure, how is the West not part of this discussion anymore? It's totally absent. When you look at most of these Twitter threads, when you look at, the news on TV, when you look at who gets represented on the news, who's allowed to voice their opinion, the West is never part of it. All right, and that's the final piece that I would say about Russian identity, Ukrainian identity, all of that. Right? It's always going to be relational, right? Under the context of what does this mean in terms of the West? By the West, is the West going to be coloring our own self-conceptions? Because the West has always colored Russian self-conceptions, right? I mean, obviously, as far back as Peter the Great, right? Peter the Great says, look, we could have a perfectly valid Russian identity, but we need to be open to any innovations that we see elsewhere. Don't be shy about taking them on, right? I mean, he was a very interesting guy. Like, he would, have, Like he was into like all sorts of shit, like medicine. Like if you were around him and you would, and he would think that like, oh, you look kind of sick, or oh, you have like, oh, you have a dental problem. He would take out these pliers, and he would, you know, he would love like removing rotten teeth. And there was like I forget which museum, but there was like a museum with like a big fucking like tin or whatever of all these teeth that he removed in his life. Right? So he's like, you know, there's clearly innovations elsewhere. We cannot simply be insular. So any kind of identity that is made by a weaker state, like it's always going to be relational in that way. Like you're always viewing, whether or not you want to, you're always seeing what is America up to. Like Russian culture all throughout the 90s, right? After the collapse of the USSR, 80% of Russians had a positive view of the United States. Less than 10 years later, 80% have a negative view of the United States. You cannot say, I have no responsibility here. You do. You have plenty of responsibility, right? You are the leading nation state in the world, right? You are saying you are the adult in the room. Democracy has won. You have some responsibilities now, sorry, right? People believe that they could be put into positions of influence in culture or world history or whatever without having tons and tons of obligations, right? When in fact it's the opposite. The only reason why you could credibly have this role that you do is specifically because you have those obligations to the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is watching. Russian culture in the 90s was very much like a mirror of like a lot of shit, like the worst shit that was going on in America, right? That gets transplanted to Russia, even in the 2000s, right? And even now. You can't escape it, right? So it's always going to be relational. So any Russian identity, positive, negative, Ukrainian, whatever, relational, right? America is always going to be in the background as you forge whatever this identity is. If you want it to be separate from America, if you're saying we want to do something else, something different, something new, you got to make sure that you're actually doing something new and not simply repeating what America is doing, changing around some terms, making it seem, you know, more religious or more millenarian or more whatever, so you could placate, you know, whatever pathological entities you have in your own nation state, but generally something new, something different. Anyway, my arm hurts. I think I'm done here. Gave you guys twice the content, right? And I'm recording the video tomorrow. Oh my God, guys. Shouldn't I have a life? Shouldn't I have some privacy? But I'm going to be doing some Russian poems. So look forward to that. Bye.